Hi, and welcome to Futurology. I'm Dawn Nakagawa, your host. In this episode, we have Nils Gilman in conversation with Elif Shafak, a prolific writer and, in my mind, an artist. Elif has been writing books for decades, and some of them are fiction and some of them are nonfiction. She's not just an incredible writer, but she is also an incredibly wise person. Core to her identity is that of being both a woman and a Turkish person living in exile. She talks about this a lot in her work, and it has shaped both her identity and the stories that she creates. So let's go to the interview with Nils Gilman and Elif Shafak on Futurology.
Elif Shafak, welcome to the Futurology podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
When someone who doesn't know your work asks you, what do you do and what do you write about? What do you tell them?
Well, I think I would tell them that I'm a storyteller, I'm a novelist, I'm a lover of literature. And maybe using James Baldwin's words, I might call myself a commuter between cultures, continents, and maybe different traditions of storytelling. But the way I connect with the world is always and always via stories and the art of storytelling.
Your background, your upbringing, you've talked about this a lot in various contexts, was surrounded by women. Mm-hmm. Speaking French early on in your life, and coming to English somewhat later. Growing up in a country where the political future never seemed obvious or guaranteed. How did that inform your early childhood thinking, and how did that lead to the kind of artistic and, intellectual work that you've done since then?
So I was born in France, in Strasbourg, but I did not live in France for a long time, mainly because my parents got separated. My father stayed in France, he got remarried, and my mom brought me to Turkey, to Ankara, to my maternal grandmother's house, which was in a very conservative, inward-looking and patriarchal neighborhood, where honestly I felt like we were the odd ones out. And then by the time I was 10, 11 years old, because of my mother's job, I went to Spain. Spanish became my second language, and then English became my third. But of course, my mother tongue is Turkish. The reason why I'm mentioning all these things is because from an early age onwards, I think there was this feeling of displacement. I had to start thinking about these concepts. What does it mean to have a home, a homeland, a motherland, an identity? Do we only represent ourselves, or do we represent something bigger than ourselves? What does it mean to belong to a nation, ethnicity? Such questions I had to ask myself from an early age onwards. And I was an introvert. I still am an introvert. I really think books became my companions. But if I may add this, I always want to think of identity not as a solid, monolithic, static entity, but as something more fluid. I think that is closer to our truth as human beings. So when I look at myself, my upbringing, my journeys, of course, being Turkish is a big part of who I am and my writing, but I equally feel attached to the Balkans. So if you put me next to a Greek author or a Bulgarian author, Romanian author, I have so much in common with them. Equally, I have so many elements from the Middle East that I carry in my soul, so if you put me next to a Lebanese, Syrian, Jordanian author, again, I have so much in common with them. But equally, I do call myself European, not only by birth, but, the values that I share. Over the years, I've become British. The UK became my home. The English language also became my home. And despite what politicians have been telling us here in the UK during the Brexit saga, I would like to think of myself as a citizen of the world. And that does not mean that you're a citizen of nowhere. That's what they told us. I disagree. So for me, rather than identity as a solid block, I think I want to think of belongings like ripples in water, like circles expanding and expanding. And the outer circle is just one human race, one humankind.
We'll get back to the question of the human, because of course in some of your more recent novels, you've gone even beyond the human in terms of narrators. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But before we get into some of the specifics of your literature, I want to spend a little bit more time talking about this question of identity and how books helped shape your own self-conception. You mentioned James Baldwin and you're being a commuter between cultures. First of all, unpack that a little bit more for us. When you read James Baldwin describe himself that way, when you see yourself in that phrase, what does that mean for you?
Well, I mean, Baldwin is amazing. I think he's not only a remarkable storyteller, but also a public intellectual, a thinker. I mean, it's a little bit funny in the UK, we use the word public intellectual in an almost negative way. People associate it with hubris or arrogance, but I don't use it in a negative way. For me, it's a positive concept. And I would love to see more public intellectuals from completely different backgrounds, for instance, from minority backgrounds. I would like to see young people accepted as public intellectuals within the public space, more women public intellectuals. So there are different traditions. France, public intellectuals are treated in a very different way. In Turkey, we often incarcerate or put on trial our intellectuals, but we do recognize that they are public intellectuals. So there are very different traditions depending on where you are. Baldwin, for me, is also an important thinker. And in one of his writings, he mentions how when we're alone, we tend to think that the sadnesses, the joys, the feelings that we carry within only belong to us, that no one else feels that way. All these struggles are unique to us. But then we read, I'm paraphrasing, I'm changing his words a little bit, but he says, then we read. And when we read, we realize we're not alone, that it has happened to other people, that they have dealt with similar situations. And those connections that we build via words, I think they're so powerful. They go beyond borders, beyond boxes. And essentially, they show us that as humanity, we've been dealing with similar things actually throughout the centuries. And the stories of each other can inspire, us. So all I'm saying is our stories are interconnected. Maybe our destinies are interconnected. Nobody's isolated and no one is as lonely as they think they are.
We'll talk in a minute about form and the importance of form in writing for making these kinds of empathetic connections. But one more question on the sort of biographical side of things. Another thing that I think you and Baldwin have in common is living overseas from one's home or one's homes, and the way in which, certainly in the case of Baldwin, I think living in France and other places in Europe helped him find a distance from being a gay Black man in the United States that helped him get more perspective on what was unique about that experience. Do you think that as somebody who's lived in many countries, you lived in the United States, you're living in the UK now, obviously you've lived in Turkey and in France, maybe other places, what is the importance for you in terms of your own self-conception and then in the writing you do of living in multiple places and having sort of put down, if not roots, then at least footprints in different places?
I would not be telling you the truth if I say it's a very smooth experience, because there's a certain melancholy. I think when you're an immigrant, there's a sense of loss. In some ways, it is a fractured existence. You have left something behind. And yet we do not forget our motherlands just because we happen to be miles or continents away. And I think we do carry them with us wherever we go. They seep into our dreams. They seep into our silences. So I love Istanbul and I feel very attached to Istanbul. In my heart, I'm still an Istanbulite. At the same time, I'm a Londoner too. So this idea, again, of multiplicity, pluralism, can we be more than one thing, is very dear to me, important to me. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I still feel like I carry Istanbul with me. For me, it's a she city. So she's very present in my writing, not as a background decor or a passive scenery, but a character on her own. So there is a sense of loss when you are an immigrant, yet at the same time, there are things you gain in terms of contact with other cultures, with people from completely different backgrounds, I am a big believer in cosmopolitan encounters. I think in life we do not learn much when we are surrounded by sameness. If all my friends think like me, vote like me, speak like me, dress up like me, I'm surrounded by my mirror image, that can be a very narcissistic existence. I think in life we learn from stories of other, and then you realize actually there is no other, the other is my sister, the other is my brother, maybe I am the other. So there's something about literature that really dismantles dualities. But for us to understand that, we need to leave our comfort zones a little bit and venture into the space of someone else. So I can't give you just a straightforward answer because it is complicated, but all I can tell you is I do think about these concepts all the time: home, motherland, exile, belonging. At the end of the day, for me as a writer, maybe home is storyland. That is where I feel most free. That is where I feel most multiple and connected to all humanity.
So let's talk a little bit about form now. One of the things that's striking about your body of work, Elif, is that you've obviously written numerous novels, but you've also written nonfiction books. You also do a lot of public speaking. You're doing a podcast now. You appear in public. You have many different ways of engaging and doing your storytelling. So I guess one question I have for you is, when you think about a story you want to tell, how do you decide, or when do you decide maybe, whether you want to make this represent whatever the story you want to tell as a nonfiction story or as a nonfiction analysis versus a fictional story with characters? What is your analytic process for deciding what form factor your narrative should take?
Yeah, such a brilliant question. To be honest, for me, fiction is where my heart beats. So always it is the art of storytelling that I come back to. And the novel in particular is a genre that I adore, because inside a novel there's room for nuance and multiplicity, for calm wisdom, dialogues. I love novels. They invite us to slow down. We're born into a world. The world we're living in right now very easily boxes us in, pushes us into boxes and asks us to remain in those boxes once and for all. Whereas when we are reading a novel for a few hours, for a few days, we leave those atomized spaces and journey into the existence of another human being. For a couple of hours, couple of days, we become someone else, or we look at the world through someone else's eyes. And then you realize that you have to do a lot of unlearning, not only learning, but unlearning as well. All these biases, stereotypes that we internalize, we need to unlearn them. But my point is, by the time we return from that journey, something has shifted in us. I really honestly believe that books change us. Why? Because it happened to me. So in that sense, fiction will always be my priority. However, I'm someone who very much believes in the curiosity of the mind. And the kind of fiction that I'm interested in is full of ideas, like novels of ideas. I honestly feel very sad when some people, some readers, no doubt with good intentions, but they say, so much is happening in today's world and I want to catch up. So I'm reading about important stuff. I read about politics, technology, neuroscience, bitcoins and that. I don't have time for fiction. And that really breaks my heart, because fiction, deals with anything and everything that's part of life can be part of fiction. So inside a novel, there is politics, there is history, there is psychology, there is philosophy, there is technology, and so on. But perhaps more importantly, there is emotional intelligence. And I don't know a single human being who does not need to connect with their emotional intelligence, particularly in this age of angst, in which emotions guide and misguide everything. Right? So whatever we do in life, whether we're designers, dentists, students, politicians, we need to connect with emotions. We need to also understand the emotional intelligence around us. What fiction does, and I think it's a little bit unfortunate that in the English language, we use the word fiction as if it were the opposite of the word fact. That is misleading. It's not like that in other traditions, like when you trace the roots of the etymology of the word edebiyat, the Arabic or Turkish word for literature comes from a completely different root. But my point is, fiction is actually very interested in truth. It does bring us closer to truth, but it does it in its own gentle way. So fiction for me is not an escapism, is not forgetting about this real world, but a very different take that brings us closer to humanity, to truth, to history, enables us to see things through a different light. So coming back to the fiction and non-fiction dilemma, at the end of the day, I think for me there's a continuity. I like to keep the mind as like an intellectual nomad. Let's read across the board, both fiction and non-fiction. Let's read extensively, and let's make our reading lists eclectic. Nothing is superior, nothing is inferior. I've never believed in that distinction between highbrow literature and lowbrow literature. So we can read graphic novels. They're fantastic for imagination. Let's read cookbooks. I think they're wonderful to understand the culture, but let's definitely read political philosophy. Let's read neuroscience, water science, and then let's definitely read fiction, different genres of fiction. So my point is, it's just this continuity, that intellectual curiosity is important for me.
I mean, if anything, fiction may be a better way to get people to engage with ideas than sort of dry texts of other sorts. People are more engaged and more inclined to, think about ideas if there's a narrative and characters that they can engage with. I studied history in college and graduate school, and almost every class I ever took, the professors would make a point of assigning fiction as part of the body of work, the body of readings that we would engage with. So I totally understand this. But your fiction in particular is often very rooted in very specific kinds of political moments. And the novel that really made you an international superstar, I think it's fair to say, is The Bastard of Istanbul, which was published, I think, in 2006 originally, right?
Yeah.
So give us a little bit of a story about the origins of that novel. Why did you want to write that? I mean, in some sense, it broke the story of the Armenian genocide wide open in a way that it's not that it had been buried before, but it really brought it into public discourse in Turkey and beyond that, importantly, in ways that, tomes of dry factual recitations hadn't as effectively. Tell us a story about how you decided to write this book, and then what the reception of it was after it was published.
Well, indeed. So maybe I should first and foremost say that as a storyteller, I've always believed that if you happen to come from a country as complicated as Turkey, you can not only be interested in stories, but you also need to be interested in silences. And I say this because, of course, Turkey has a very rich history, a very long history, but that does not necessarily translate into strong memory. If anything, it's quite the opposite. We're a society of collective amnesia. And our entire relationship with the past is full of ruptures. And once you have that kind of void, it's very easy to fill in that empty space with a rhetoric of ultranationalism or imperial nostalgia that talks about what a great empire we were always and always. But then, as a writer, you ask seemingly small questions. You say, okay, what was the empire like, for instance, for women? And then there's a big silence. What was the Ottoman Empire like for a peasant woman in Anatolia who had no access to power, authority? What was it like for a prostitute in a big city? What was it like for a concubine who was not necessarily the favorite of the Sultan? You see, in these areas, there's an immense silence. Equally, the moment you start asking questions about minorities, what was the empire like for an Armenian silversmith, for a Jewish miller, for an Arab peasant, or a Kurdish farmer, or a Greek sailor, and so on? Again, there are There's a big, big silence. So the way history is being taught to us, particularly I'm talking about the textbooks, is always taught as his story. And by that I mean the story of a few sultans, maybe a few Shaykhul Islams, which were the men at the top of the religious hierarchy, but that's about it. Other than that, there are no individuals. And as a writer, I am interested in those forgotten stories, in those erased or silent stories. I think literature has an ability to bring the periphery to the center, to make the unheard a little bit better heard, and the invisible perhaps more visible. Literature has an ability to rehumanize people who have been dehumanized. That has always been my approach, my understanding from the very beginning. And so when I started writing The Bastard of Istanbul, it was once again with a desire to give more voice to those silences. And the Armenian genocide, if not, is one of the biggest silences, if not the biggest. But I need to tell you that from my point of view, this is a very constructive book in the sense that it does tell the story of a Turkish family and an Armenian American family through the eyes of generations of women. It deals with amnesia, what has been forgotten, suppressed, but also it deals with what we have in common. When the book came out in Turkey, the reception from readers, many readers actually, was quite positive. But simultaneously, I, as an author, was put on trial. And that was completely unexpected.
What were you put on trial for?
So I was put on trial for insulting Turkishness. That was the accusation. We have an article in our constitution which protects Turkishness against insults, even though nobody quite knows what that means. And therefore, it is quite open to interpretation and misinterpretation.
Is this sort of like lèse majesté, but for the nation?
For the nation, indeed. And in a way, this article had been used against journalists, against historians before, but never ever against a fiction writer. So that's why I was not expecting such a thing, and no one was.
In a way, this sort of corroborates your point that all of writing can have this mode of engagement. It doesn't just have to be nonfiction or fiction that have radically distinct audiences. So paradoxically, almost, or perversely, the fact that you were put on trial, as bad as it is, demonstrates the point you were making earlier.
I appreciate your words. It was quite surreal as well, because the words of fictional characters were taken out of the book, the text, and they were used as evidence in the courtroom. And the prosecutor asked for 3 years in prison. As a result of which, in a way, my Turkish lawyer had to defend my Armenian American fictional character's words as he was defending me. So it felt very almost Kafkaesque, almost surreal. And in the meantime, there were ultranationalist groups on the streets spitting out my pictures, burning my pictures, burning EU flags. So that whole year was quite unsettling. And I wish I can say that, as time went by, we became a more democratic country where now things are easier. It's quite the opposite. It's a difficult place for writers, for poets, anyone who deals with words, but also cartoonists. Years later, 2 other of my books were investigated by a prosecutor, this time for the quote-unquote crime of obscenity. 2 novels, The Gaze and 10 minutes, 38 seconds in the Strange World. Again, I write about issues related to gender violence, child brides, which in my opinion means child abuse, which is a reality. There's a big number of child brides, but also issues like sexual violence. My central character in 10 minutes, 38 seconds in the Strange World is a sex worker in Istanbul. So when you deal with these subjects, you can also offend the authorities. So my point is, whatever you write about, from politics to history to sexuality to gender, you can offend the authorities, or you can offend some groups in the civil society. And that's a very difficult environment for an author, because as writers, we do need freedom of speech.
We absolutely need freedom of speech. On the other hand, I've always felt that if one writes something that doesn't make anybody upset, you probably should have written something else. Because it's worth provoking people to think differently, and that will inevitably upset some people. So if you don't upset anybody when you write something, you probably should have written something a little bit more provocative. But I want to go back to this general point about writing from the margins, finding socially marginalized characters, investigating the silences of the archive, using literature to sort of fill in the blank spaces that the archive hasn't preserved. All of this is a hallmark of sort of classic features of post-colonial literature. Do you think of yourself as as writing in a post-colonial modality? And the reason I ask this is this connects in an interesting way to what you were discussing earlier about thinking of yourself as engaged in telling stories about particular identities, layered identities, but also being cosmopolitan in a fundamental way.
When I look at myself, I think the only description that I would use would be storyteller or novelist. I don't necessarily describe myself as even, this kind of novelist, that kind of novelist. I just say I'm a novelist. And I'm not even sure, do we choose the subjects that we write about, or do those subjects come and choose us or find us? The reason why I'm saying this is because it's not a very rational process throughout. Like, you're not always in control, in charge of everything. Sometimes I follow the flow of language. Sometimes you put one word there because the other word demands it. So there's also a subconscious, there's also the irrational seeping into a novel. It's a very immersive experience. I think there are two different ways of writing a novel. In the first way, you're a little bit like, you're doing some kind of engineering. The novelist is a little bit above the text, and it's a very cerebral activity. I have a lot of respect for people who write like that, but it's not my way. I like the second way, in which you write with your intuition. You're a little bit drunk. You don't quite know where you're going. You don't walk a straight line, but you follow that intuition. All of which is to say, you don't make rational decisions in your mind and then say, okay, I'm going to write this kind of book because this is the kind of message I want to give, right? But organically, all the subjects that you mentioned in terms of writing from the margins, being interested in those layers of forgotten history and so on, organically, I go in that direction because of who I am, because of the land where I come from. And in that regard, you're right, there's a commonality. There are many writers who are dealing with these subjects all across the world, and they come from complicated lands, complicated histories. If I may add this, I'm very interested in the duality between memory and amnesia. Yeah, I do observe particularly immigrant families on both sides of the Atlantic. But not only immigrants, any family that has experienced some kind of displacement. It intrigues me how there are generational differences in the way we respond to memory and amnesia. For instance, when you look at the older generation, and usually they're the ones who have experienced the biggest hardships, they do not usually talk about the past. It does not mean they've forgotten the past. It's just they don't know how to talk about it. It sits inside their chest, unspoken, all those words. The second generation usually is not interested in the past either, but for a completely different reason, because they need to find their feet, they need to build a new life, tabula rasa, they need to be forward-looking. But that leaves the third or the fourth generations in these families today. I think they're the ones who are asking the biggest questions, the deepest questions about ancestral heritage, not only family stories, but also family silences. Sometimes in a family you meet 4 siblings, but only one of them does the memory keeping, not the other siblings. Why is it like that? So I'm interested in memory keepers, and I would like to believe that writers are the memory keepers of their era, of their society, not because we want to be stuck in the past, but we need to honor, we need to understand the complexity of the past. What we cannot remember, I don't think we can repair. And what we cannot repair will keep coming back again and again. It's an illusion to think that time is a steady, progressive march. We want to believe that the arc of history bends towards justice. We want to believe in a linear progression of time, but that's a construct of the mind. When you follow the stories of nature, for instance, even one river, let's say the River Thames, it makes you question, is time really linear? What do I mean by that? The Thames is a zombie, this beautiful river that shapes London. It's a zombie because not that long ago it was declared biologically dead. 150 years ago, it was treated with such carelessness. It was full of such filth and dirt that people thought, okay, nothing can survive in these waters anymore. But fast forward, today the Thames is home to more than 200, close to 300 biospecies. But instead of admiring the river, once again, today, water companies, as we're speaking, in the name of money, in the name of greed, in the name of profit, they're pumping sewage into the same river. So my point is, follow the history of a river. Is it linear? Is it cyclical? And in that regard, I think memory is important so that we can learn from these cycles of history.
Yeah, in the case of these kinds of pollutants, the memories in the river are literally embedded in the soil.
Yeah.
The soils, the substrates.
Yeah.
So the River Thames as a character, or as a potential character, brings up the issue was one of the things that was really striking to me as I read one of your more recent novels, The Island of Missing Trees, which is sort of oscillates between contemporary London and Cyprus in the 1970s as civil war broke out from the late 1960s into the 1970s. And there's all sorts of interesting things you do with moving back and forth in time between things that had happened or things that may have happened in Cyprus in the 1970s, and the ability of the characters in 2019 London to be able to recall those things. But another striking feature of the novel is that it's narrated not just from the point of view of humans or the human characters, but there's other characters. Tell us about the other characters, the non-human characters in the novel, and why you thought it was important for the purpose of this story to include non-human narrators as part of your narrative strategy.
So in the Island of Missing Trees, I have an unusual character in a fig tree, and this fig tree, it's a she tree. She speaks. I wish you had seen my agent's face when I told him that I was writing a novel.
From the point of view of a fig tree.
And there was going to be a tree in it, and this tree was going to talk. And for a flicker, I saw this flicker of anxiety, flicker of panic in his eyes, which I completely understand because it was scary. It was a risk. It's a risk because if it doesn't work, the whole structure collapses. And we're talking about literary fiction, and you are taking a risk by making a tree talk. However, I heard the sound, the voice of this tree in my soul, in my heart, in my mind, day and night. I kept hearing her, and I believed in her, and I wanted to follow that voice. Underlying that is my belief that when we destroy each other as human beings in the name of nationalism, in the name of religion, in the name of whatever ideology, we're not only killing each other and creating so much sorrow, but we're also destroying this environment of which we are a tiny part. We're not above nature, we're not outside of nature, and surely we don't own nature. We're only a small part of a very delicate ecosystem. So wherever there's a civil war, whenever there has been a genocide, the land is also destroyed, water is also destroyed, the air, the trees, the orchards. And it felt important for me to make those connections between human suffering and the destruction of a whole ecology, and why these things are not separate issues. I believe we live in a world in which we cannot be single issue people in a way. If we care about human suffering, we have to care about what's going on, on our planet, the destruction of the planet. If I may give you an example. For instance, water crisis is one of the most acute problems in the world right now. And for those of us coming from the Middle East, this is not an abstract hypothesis.
It's now.
It is happening right now, because out of the most 10 water-stressed nations in the world, right now, 7 of them are in the Middle East and in North Africa. So that region in particular, our rivers are dying, and it's visible, it's drying up. Certainly this has consequences for everyone, but particularly for women, for children, and for the poor. They are the ones shouldering this burden in a disproportionate way. Usually in traditional communities, young women are water carriers, right? They bring water to their villages. If there's no drinkable water nearby, the distance that a young woman has to walk increases, unfortunately increasing the possibility for gender violence. So in our minds, we put these things in separate boxes. This is the box for climate crisis. This is the box for water scarcity. Here's another drawer for, women's rights, another drawer for racial inequality, and so on. But in life, there are no boxes. There are no drawers. Everything is interconnected. And the drop of water or a fig tree reminds us of this reality that we are connected as fellow human beings beyond borders, but we're also connected with nature.
Yeah, the fig tree is a major character, maybe almost the major character in the novel. But you have other. I think there's a scene where there's a hummingbird, I believe. Yeah. Also narrates a scene. There's a scene where I think there's an insect that narrates a particular scene. So you actually diversify the voices in the novel a lot. And I know you're very interested in philosophy. And this is the question I wanted to ask you about the philosophical implications of this. I realize that you're taking a certain literary liberty in writing this way. And there's a sort of an anthropomorphization in the sense of putting words and thoughts that would be human-like into the mind of a tree or the mind of a bird or the mind of an insect. But I think, Thomas Nagel's famous essay, What's It Like to Be a Bat? One of the most famous philosophical essays of the last century. His basic answer is, we can never really know what it's like to be a bat, what it's like to have echolocation and travel. Are there bats also that speak in this novel, perhaps?
No, it's the tree that speaks, but right. Because the tree is connected with the roots and insects.
She can hear,
but it's always the tree that speaks.
So the reason why I think about this as being very interesting in the context of your earlier statements about the commitment to cosmopolitanism and to using literature to be able to create a sense of common understanding across cultural barriers or gender barriers or class barriers or sexual orientation barriers, or I don't even want to call them barriers, but just gaps perhaps. Thinking of yourself as a bridge builder and a commuter between these things. Nagel, in a sense, says there's a certain line beyond which we cannot build bridges in terms of our consciousness. And he says that a bat is too far for us to really know, us humans, to really know what it's like to be a bat. When you think about that line, I mean, you obviously think that all humans can, if we try, understand each other. And then now in this novel, you have a tree that speaks and that can communicate in complicated ways with some of the characters, human characters in the novel. When you think about that as a philosophical statement, how do you think about the cross-species communication issue and understanding issues? Can we understand what it's like to be the Thames? Can we understand what it's like to be a tree? And if so, what is that nature of that understanding in your mind?
It's a fascinating question. As I was writing my latest novel, There Are Rivers in the Sky, I had to think about this repeatedly because at the center of that book is a tiny little raindrop. I do not make the raindrop talk, but I had to think about the raindrop's journey a lot. And maybe it was not only an intellectual question, it was almost like a spiritual question after a while. Maybe it's the same question that William Blake asked when he talked about whether we can see a whole world in a tiny grain, a grain of sand. So the point is, you take something seemingly very small and insignificant and you treat it as the microcosmos. And can you see something bigger in that? I guess my point is, it all depends on what is our starting point. If our starting point is this rational mind that looks at the world from above, we will come up with a different approach. But then we forget that there are various other approaches in the world. If I may give you an example, I wrote in this latest novel, I wrote about one of the oldest minorities in the world called the Yazidis. They're one of the most maligned, misunderstood, and unfortunately persecuted minorities in the region. When you listen to Yazidi grandmothers, it's so interesting. I had to do lots of interviews. I had to do a lot of listening because this is a culture that's mostly based on oral storytelling rather than written texts. So you really need to be a listener to try to understand. One thing that struck me was when you listen to Yazidi grandmothers, particularly in the month of April, they advise their grandchildren who are, running around, jumping up and down like children do. They advise them, they tell them, be careful, tread carefully, gently, just do not run around, just don't stomp your feet harshly. Why? Because in the month of April, the earth is pregnant, according to this, approach. So to our rational, logical, modern mind, this might sound very irrational, but I think only a culture that has not disconnected itself from nature will say such a thing. Now, I was raised by a grandmother who was very traditional, and some might say superstitious. My grandmother was not a very well-educated woman, only because she had been pulled out of school in Turkey for being a girl at an early age, and she wholeheartedly believed in women's education. And she was one of the wisest people I've ever met in life. I think with her sheer existence, she showed me that there are different paths to knowledge. One might not have a fancy diploma on the wall, but one can still be a wise human being. Or the opposite, one can graduate from a very posh, well-known college, but one can still be ignorant, right?
For my sins, I've known a lot more of the second type than the first.
So, there are different paths of knowledge. And in my grandmother's universe, water had a voice. The earth said something. Trees rustled and whispered. Mountains rumbled and told something. In all the folk tales of the Balkans, Anatolia, Middle East, earth has a voice. Nature tells us things. Of course, at the end of the day, you're telling me it's the human brain that interprets this. But I am saying when we forget that earth has voices, when we forget that trees are much more sentient than we realize, we become so arrogant, we become so distanced, and we start to define ourselves as consumers of nature. Primarily, we become consumers. And that is not helping us. That is not helping our civilizations, and it's not helping nature either. So how do we reconnect? We artists do it in this way. Someone does it through a completely different way. But my point is, I do believe that nature is full of stories, and we need to honor and try to understand those stories.
One of the hallmarks of European high modernism, and this has been written about in many different registers by scholars as different as Martin Heidegger or James Scott, has had a typical tendency to regard the natural world as other from the human, and as a kind of standing reserve of resources to be exploited by humans. And there's a kind of imperialist gaze that applies to nature. And of course, many people have written about how you start out by doing that with the plants and the animals, and you almost inevitably end up doing it to some of the human beings too. And there's been a big effort, I think, goes back arguably centuries, in the form of anti-colonial resistance. But certainly even within the Western philosophical tradition in the last 50 to 75 years, to try to overcome that through different kinds of ethical frameworks. One of the things we talk about quite a bit at the Berggruen Institute is an ethics based on the principle of multi-species flourishing. I'm wondering what you think of a phrase like that. In my estimation, this is sort of an extension of the idea of cosmopolitanism to include not just the human family, but all of the other creatures that we are inextricably interdigitated with. Is that a similar vision to the one that you have for how humans ideally, people, I don't want to say humans, people should relate to the world that they inhabit?
Yeah, I find this question so important. I mean, we always need to question, where does our knowledge come from, and what else we're missing out? Who is telling the story and who is not allowed to tell the story? Where are the silences? Personally, of course, I grew up with European novels. I love the canon. I love this entire literature, and I feel so attached to it. But I also want to be able to tell you that this is not the only tradition that I feel attached to. I also feel connected, in addition to the European novel, for instance, to the oral storytelling of the Balkans, the Middle East, the Levant, just to give you an example. Now, to me, this is very important because sometimes in our readings, in our knowledge, we tend to become very Eurocentric. And we forget that there are different sources of knowledge and there are also different ways of storytelling in many other parts of the world. That is why it's so important to have A, interdisciplinary conversations, B, intercultural conversations. Now, what you're saying even expands that further because you take that and you're saying, what about nature? What about other biospecies? Let's bring that in. And I'm fully, in agreement with what you're saying. Then we realize that as human beings, we are not above anything, not outside anything, but we are a small part of a very complex and delicate ecosystem in every sense. And what happens in one part of the world will affect our lives in another part, in another continent. We live in a world in which we are way too interconnected to have the illusion that some kind of nationalistic isolationism is going to make us, safer and completely separate from the sorrows and problems of the rest of humanity. We are on this planet together, and this is our only home. So what you're saying, I think, is very important. And there have been many philosophers, going all the way back to Spinoza, and before, many ancient Greek philosophers who wanted us to think of identity, belonging in such terms, or to approach in a, maybe, if you will, pantheistic way, connecting with nature. But we lost that. We lost those connections. And I think sometimes we become so obsessed with finding a new way of thinking that we forget there's a lot of wisdom in some of those ancient teachings and ancient poems and ancient philosophies.
Another thing that you've spoken about at length, in fact, the very first conversation I had with you almost 20 years ago now, Elif, one of the things that you really emphasized, because we were talking about in that conversation 20 years ago about political Islam, and one of the things that you emphasized to me in that conversation was the importance of another tradition within Islam, which I think is a little bit better known now in the West than it was 20 years ago, but still is somewhat obscure, I think, to most Americans, most Westerners, and Europeans as well, which is the mystical tradition and the Sufi tradition. And I think that maybe I can just ask an open-ended question for you about sort of the role that mysticism plays in your life in particular, and in particular how, and beyond that specifically, how you think about Sufism as an important part of the way you engage with the spiritual panoply of options.
I'm not a religious person at all. The way, you might disagree with me, but the way the many religions divide humanity into us versus them, and somehow the way many people assume that us is closer to truth or closer to God than them, that dualistic approach is not close to my heart at all. I think I'm interested in spirituality, but I differentiate that completely from religiosity. What scares me is absolute certainties and the clash of absolute certainties. So someone who is extremely sure of their religiosity or someone who is extremely sure of their atheism, I think in both I hear an emphasis on certainty. Whereas I am much more interested in agnosticism, agnostics or mystics who are a little bit like misfits, that were walking a very thin line between faith and doubt. I like it when faith and doubt hold hands. I like it when faith and doubt dance together and challenge each other, So the problem when I look at people who are very sure of their religiosity is they want to get rid of doubt. But faith without doubt is a dogma, and I think dogmas are very dangerous. On the other hand, someone who's very sure of their atheism wants to get rid of faith. But faith can be, a secular concept. It does not need to be a religious concept. For instance, when we start writing a novel, you don't quite know what you're doing. You don't even know whether you're going to succeed, whether the story is going to get you anywhere, but you still keep going. That's a secular act of faith. When you move to another city, you don't know if you're going to be happy there, but you do it anyway. Something tells you to do it. When you fall in love, you don't quite know if that's the right person for you, but you follow your heart. Those are secular acts of faith. So my point is, there is another approach, which is a bit more humble. And it's an approach where you can say, I don't know all the answers. I'm still on a journey. I'm still thinking. I have no labels. And I don't want to have labels. I'm just on a journey of learning. I like those spiritual journeys.
I agree entirely that faith and doubt have to exist in a dialectic with each other. If you go too far to either pole, you either become dogmatic or you lose all confidence and ability to act if you are dwelling entirely in the space of doubt. And you really do need to be in a dialogue between doubt and faith. And I don't think it's a coincidence that almost every religious tradition that I can think of has a spiritualist and a mysticist dimension to it, right? You have Sufism in Islam, but you also have, various forms of Jewish mysticism and the Kabbalah. Obviously, there's many Christian mysticism. There's plenty of mysticism in Hinduism as well. So all of these religions, I don't want to say, I'm not sure it's universal, but there's usually some kind of a deep tradition within most of these religious traditions. And it struck me on reading your material, both your fiction and your nonfiction, that there's often a character in your novels who represent that moment. And I don't know whether this is something you've done intentionally or if it just happens to emerge from you every time you write a novel. Because I haven't read all your novels, but every one I've read has at least one character where that particular theme is brought forward explicitly so that all the characters need to come to terms with that dimension of the human experience.
I think we're talking about something very, very universal and very timeless. So, as you mentioned, within each of the three main monotheistic religions, we see these threads of mysticism. And in that regard, when you bring together people like Rumi or Shams of Tabriz with Teresa de Avila or Isaac Luria, or Hildegard, these people have so much in common. It's fascinating. People who have never met each other, they might have lived in completely different places or centuries, but the questions they're asking can be very similar. Equally, when I look at Hinduism, Taoism, Buddhism, I see those mystical threads in there as well. So there is a universal search for longing and very central questions about what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be mortal? What does it mean to be on this earth? These are very philosophical questions. I guess my point is, the way I interpret mysticism, and I, as I said, I don't like labels, so I don't call myself a mystic or Sufi or anything like that. I'm only a storyteller. The way I am looking at these ancient teachings is that I think there's a desire to transcend the self. And in that regard, I see a commonality with literature, because also in literature, there's a desire, at least in the way I interpret literature, there's a desire to transcend the self. Now, again, we live in a world in which we are constantly encouraged to write our stories. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with the autobiographical aspect of literature. I have a lot of respect for that. And that's the beauty of literature. There's room for all that diversity. But where I am criticizing is, as we emphasize the autobiographical aspect of literature, we're not emphasizing enough or encouraging enough the transcendental nature or aspect of literature. If I may give an example, in many creative writing workshops and courses, the very first thing we teach students is write what you know. And many students end up thinking, well, then I have to write about what happened to me. Again, that is admirable. There's nothing wrong with that. But we never say write what you feel. because the heart is always bigger than identity politics. If you feel it in your heart, if you can make that journey, if you want to transcend that box and feel what the other has felt, go for it, Nothing is stopping you. Art allows you to do that. So my point is, in both mysticism and literature, I think what you realize is, first of all, that these dualities are products of the mind, like the us versus them, me and the other. And it helps us to transcend those dualities, to dismantle those dualities. And then you realize, actually, we're talking about oneness. And in that regard, I see commonalities between mysticism and literature.
Obviously, one of the big signal events of this decade has been the arrival of large language models and artificial intelligence more broadly. Some people think that we're heading towards superintelligence or artificial general intelligence, and there's a huge debate about what those terms even mean, let alone whether we're technologically capable of getting there given the current trajectory of these technologies. But leave aside the technical questions. Do you think there's anything about these technologies, and I don't know how much you've played around with them or used them, that will eventually be able to reveal to us or help us understand ourselves better in precisely the way that you were just talking about? Do you think that these are eventually tools of self-discovery and new narrative possibilities?
I think we're at the beginning of something completely unprecedented. And it is happening too fast. And we don't even have time to process the change that's happening in this moment, because immediately something else is happening. Immediately something else is happening. So we feel almost like catapulted into the future. It really reminds me of this painting by Paul Klee that Walter Benjamin talks about, this angel. In a way, you're being forced to move forward without quite processing that moment in time. That's how I feel this moment is. I'm very cautious when it comes to these large language models, but digital technologies and the proliferation of these technologies in general. If I may take you back in time a little bit, you will remember not that long ago, there was so much optimism in the world, let's say 20 years ago. And back then, the biggest optimists were tech optimists. They were telling us that thanks to the proliferation of social media, digital technologies, democracy was going to spread everywhere. Why? Because information was going to spread. So if you can make information go in all directions, everyone was going to become informed citizens. Informed citizens could only make informed choices, and that would be the end of authoritarianism or any other model. It was the triumph of liberal democracy. From this moment onwards, that was the prediction back then, history could only go in one direction. We were all going to become one big global village. Back then, again, I remember with good intentions, a young Egyptian couple, there was so much trust in Facebook, for instance, that they named their newborn baby girl Facebook. I think about her a lot, now she's a teenager. What kind of a world have we given her? Because from that moment of extreme optimism, we have swung to the other opposite, and it's a moment of pessimism now. I think when we talk about technology in general, we have to remember that this is basically like the moon. It does have a bright side. It does have a very dark side that we're not seeing. As a woman from the Middle East, how can I underestimate the bright side, for instance, of social media? When in many cases, media freedoms were curbed and curtailed, people found pockets of expression, chance to express themselves on social media. Many women did, many young people did, many minorities did. So all of that, for instance, I find positive. But then this other side where we see misinformation, disinformation, slander, hate speech, the abuse that particularly women are getting on social media. So we're not talking about these things enough. And because we haven't focused on the dark side of these technologies enough, I think we have to do so urgently. To be honest, I wouldn't want any politician, any political party, or any company to have absolute power. It is not healthy to have extreme power. We're all humans. We all need to balance each other. We need checks and balances. So that is one thing that really worries me, that monopolization of power. The other thing is oftentimes when it's another issue, the copyright issues, how, books are being scanned and etc. But within those large language models, the knowledge that is being presented is tilted in one direction. It's usually a very Eurocentric and West-centric literature that is being, in a way, emphasized as the main source of knowledge, whereas the knowledge of many minorities, people from different parts of the world, all that oral storytelling that I was talking about, that is being erased as we're speaking. So my point is, there are things that I appreciate, such as advances in medicine. Amazing progress can be achieved in medicine. But then this other side, the monopoly of power, the spread of disinformation, but basically we are in this moment in which we can't quite grasp what is happening because it's happening so much faster than our legal, social, political response can catch up with. That is a scary thing. And so my point is, as citizens of humanity, I think we need to engage in this conversation. We should not think that, well, technology is too complicated. Let us leave it to tech companies. It's way too important to leave it to a few companies or to a few decision makers in a few companies. I think this is a conversation in which we all need to be engaged with.
I really appreciate that answer, and in particular, the recollection of the incredible optimism that obtained 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, about the liberatory potential of social media. That narrative has completely switched, where now we think of social media as, causing eating disorders and suicides, particularly with young women, and it leads to the spread of disinformation and so on. So the narrative has completely switched about that. So the question we always like to close these podcasts with is to try to project that forward. What is something we believe most people assume about the future today, assume about the future, could be politics, technology, society, what have you, or the self, that you think is probably wrong, and that in 20 years, there will be as big a reversal as we've seen over the last 20 years about social media?
Oh, I need to think about this.
Take your time.
The reason why I'm hesitating is because everything that I think about right now is not a complete reversal, but a combination. I don't know if that makes sense.
Sure.
So when I think about the future, one thing that worries me is this ability that we have to swing from one end to the other. From extreme optimism, we came to extreme pessimism. I wouldn't want us to go back to that moment. And perhaps it's better for us to have a healthy dose of optimism and a healthy dose of pessimism. I really am a big believer in what Gramsci was talking about. The pessimism of the intellect. I think that's a good thing because it makes us maybe more aware of what can happen and what is happening, and we will stop taking things for granted. But then you need to keep the heart optimistic, right? The human will has to remain hopeful. So we need hope. And where's that hope going to come from? I think it's going to come primarily from our fellow human beings. When we connect beyond borders, when we learn each other's stories, that really puts things into perspective. When you listen to a young girl in Afghanistan right now, a woman in Iran, someone in a different part of the world, their stories, which are usually not covered, I think help us to understand where we are in this moment and give us more maybe strength, resilience. So I really find those human-to-human connections beyond borders very important. The second layer of connectivity that I find important is the one we build with nature. So with trees, with rivers, just sitting under a tree or walking by a river and remembering its story, remembering the longue durée, the longevity of time, so not being stuck only in this moment in time. I think it's a very humbling exercise for the mind. And the third connection that I find important is the inner one. I don't know what to call that. Some people like Voltaire, he used to call it the inner garden. Other people call it meditation. I don't have a word for it, but I will follow Voltaire and I will call it the inner garden. We all have an inner garden that we're responsible for. And I think we need to take good care of that. So in the future, I would love these three connections being strengthened. If there's one thing that really, really worries me, is the lack of all emotions. It is numbness. It's apathy. It's the moment we become desensitized, disconnected. And that's something that Hannah Arendt was warning us against, right? So all I will say is for this moment and for the future, I would love these three connections being rebuilt.
Elif Shafak, thank you so much for coming on the Futurology podcast.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.